I would like to feature a story. This is a true story about the country that I live in. We live at 7,000 feet. And my entire existence there, I have never seen a rattlesnake. Until a week ago, when it was cold. And there's a pit by my back door, and it's full of rattlesnakes. Now I've discovered that they're amazing little creatures, and I've befriended one of them. I call her Mrs. Smith. She's a delightful little creature, and she lives in that pit by my back door that I call Pittsburgh. And she hisses in her pit. But she has all of these little hissers that she's raising, and they hiss in the pit with her. But she's had some horrible health issues. She'd had a hysterectomy. And she wasn't feeling very well, and she told all her little hissers, "Why don't you guys stay here in the pit and hiss, and I'm going to slither off to the store for some meds. Maybe an antihistamine will help." And they said, "Mom, okay, we'll stay here in the pit and hiss." But she says, "Now listen, kids, if you get scared, you can slither over to Mrs. Potts' house and hiss in her pit." "Okay, Mom, that sounds good." So they're all hissing away in the pit. And there was this shadow that came over the pit. And it was the shadow of a golden eagle. And golden eagles like to eat little rattlesnakes. And they became sorely afraid. That's because they called on their bellies sorely. And they slithered over to Mrs. Potts' pit to hiss there. And they were hissing in Mrs. Potts' pit. And all of her little hissers were hissing in the pit with her. And they were hissing in this big ball. And Mrs. Potts came out, and she had a hissy fit. And she says, "All of you little hissers that aren't mine, I want you to slither back to your own pit and hiss there. Get out of mine." And so they did. And about that time, Mrs. Smith came back from the store. And she says, "By golly," she says, "I thought you guys would be all afraid and you'd slither over to Mrs. Potts' pit to hiss there." "Well, we were, Mom, but Mrs. Potts came out and she had a hissy fit and sent us home." And Mrs. Smith says, "Well, imagine the nerve of that woman. I remember when Mrs. Potts didn't have a pit to hiss in."
Drive the Togwotee Trail. It's the road that's really a trip.